So the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, Dateline. That's our series that we're in right now. Normally, Justin, our lead pastor, teaches, but he is on spring break, so he's not with us. He said something about working at some tree company all week while he's on spring break. I don't know what that's about. But speaking of that tree company, so we have to use a lot of different kinds of equipment to get our work done. And so there was, we typically use like a loader to move logs around, and it has like forks on the front, and you stick the forks in, you lift the log up, and then you go dump it in the truck. However, sometimes we want situations where we could grab onto it instead of just use forks. And so they make this thing called like a grapple or a grapple bucket. So you put it on the front of your loader, and it can grab like this with like a control in the machine. And so I was searching. Also, Elaine, quiet down while Dad's talking. So I was looking into this. I was doing a lot of research on these grapple buckets, and they were kind of expensive. They were expensive to buy. I kept looking, and then I found one on Facebook Marketplace, and I was like, "Whoa, this is actually affordable. It's cheaper than the rest of them." So I sent it to my friend Joseph, and I'm like, "Hey, would this be a good option? Is this a good brand or whatever?" He goes, "I've never heard of that brand." And I was like, "Well, it's like 1/3 the price, and it's brand new." And so we went and we bought that grapple bucket for that cheaper price. And when we first started using it, we thought it was great. We thought it was fantastic. The first few days, it was awesome. It was grabbing logs, it was grabbing brush, and it was making our life what seemed a lot better. However, we used it for then more than a few days, and it started falling apart. Like the teeth that would grab, they would just start bending like crazy. It was made out of a cheap metal that was continually bending. The hydraulic hoses that went in and out of the grapple were bursting, were leaking. We had to replace them. And literally within the week, what we thought was such a good deal, we were like, "Oh man, this is cheap, this is sweet." It actually was a crappy, cheap piece of junk. And it was not a good decision. It was a cheap alternative to something that could have been really good. I know that me and Justin give a lot of analogies of like tree work or like football or blah, 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 but that's because like that's what we do. That's kind of like our thing. And so if you were teaching, you would do the same thing, that you'd have analogies from your life. But the guys that I work with, they are cool guys. They're humble, they're nice, they work hard, they care about their families. We're not the most educated group of guys in the world. Sometimes we have to put our foot in our mouth, sometimes we're overzealous, but we're good guys. And one of the guys in the Bible that I think seems a lot like the guys that we work with his name was Peter. So Peter was an uneducated fisherman. So he was a blue-collar guy. He didn't have fancy degrees. He didn't have this, that, or the other thing. But what he did have was he was good in nature. He worked hard, and he was a fisherman. And he was one of the closest eyewitnesses to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. He was actually the first to claim that Jesus was the Christ. A lot of people, sometimes people think like Jesus Christ was his last name. It's actually a title, meaning God's chosen one or God's anointed one. Peter was the first to claim that. And so through this Dateline series, we're looking at eyewitness accounts of the death and resurrection. And today we're looking specifically at Peter's eyewitness account of Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate. We're looking at it in the book of Mark. So Mark is one of the 4 Gospels that's in the New Testament. So there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And all 4 are different eyewitness accounts of the events of Jesus. And I know what you're thinking. If this is Peter's account, why is it called Mark? Well, because Peter was uneducated, he needed somebody who was more educated to write down what he saw. So he got a guy named John Mark who scribed what Peter saw. So whenever you read the book of Mark, you're looking at it from the perspective of Peter, and John Mark was the one writing it. And so, all that said, we are about to dive in, but before we dive into the actual account of the trial, you need to know what's going on in the time period leading up to that. So, it was Passover, which is like the biggest yearly thing for the Jews. Justin compared it the other week to, say, Mardi Gras, where everyone goes to New Orleans. It's packed and it's really fun. But none of us has been to Mardi Gras. Much more applicable was obviously bike time in Muskegon, when everyone swells from all over the country to Muskegon for bike time. It's a pretty huge deal. Not really, but if you like older people in leather walking around in a hot summer day, you should go to bike time downtown. It's a good time. So it's Passover. It's a Jewish festival. They're remembering when God delivered them from slavery in Egypt. So it's Passover. There's a ton of people in town. And then there's Palm Sunday, which Justin talked about last week. It's the Sunday before Easter, so the Sunday coming into Passover is Palm Sunday. Jesus arrives into Jerusalem, and everyone is taking out these palm branches. They're taking off their coats, and they're laying it down, and Jesus comes into town, and it's really hype and exciting. People are like, Jesus is here. He's finally bringing the deliverance. They were expecting that Jesus was going to overthrow the Roman control over the Jews. In this time period, we're in the region of Judea. It's the Jewish people that we're looking at their perspective, but Rome was in charge of them. So there's the Roman side and the Jewish side. And this is where Jesus is coming in. He was a Jew. People are like, oh, sweet, we're not going to have to listen to Rome anymore. So we're really excited. That's what Palm Sunday was. And then throughout the week, from Sunday until the account that we're talking about today, which happens on early Friday morning, a lot of things happen, and the crowd actually shifts rather quickly. After Palm Sunday, where everything was hype and exciting, Jesus is here, he's going to deliver us. Jesus taught in the temple, and instead of talking and teaching about an earthly kingdom of overthrowing Rome, he talked more about a spiritual kingdom and overthrowing sin. And so people quickly turned, because they're like, oh, you're not going to deliver us from Rome? We don't like that. So he was teaching in the temple. He was anointed with perfume, which Justin talked about last week. And then they have the Last Supper. And they're almost turning into hiding mode now, because people are turning against Jesus. They are not liking Jesus because of what he was teaching. It was not what they expected, not what they wanted. So they have the Last Supper. And then Jesus has the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he prays to God. He says, please don't make me go to this cross. He's praying. He doesn't want to do it. But he knows that that's what he's here to do. And then he has, after he prays, then Jesus is arrested by the Jewish leaders. And now he has to go through the trial with the Jews. Because remember, there's the Jews and the Romans. He goes through the trial with the Jews. And they are saying, hey, we're going to bring you to Rome because you're a big problem. You're not teaching what we want. Da-da-da-da-da. And then Peter, sorry, this is a lot, but it's really important to get all these leading action steps until we're actually at the spot we're reading today. And then Peter, the guy who we're looking at his eyewitness account, actually disowns Jesus because of how angry and mad the people were at Jesus. He disowns him. And this is now on really, really late Thursday / turning into early Friday morning. And that sets the scene. We wake up with the rooster crow, cockle-doodle-doo, because that wakes us up, and it also was the signifying thing that Peter had disowned Jesus. And here we are, finally, to Mark 15, verses 1 through 15. I'm going to read the whole thing. Again, this is Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. And yeah, I'm going to read the whole thing, and then we're going to go back through and look at the verses. Mark 15, 1 through 15. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, Crucify him. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So a recap, the Jewish leaders bring him to Pilate. Imagine Pilate is in like a big cement chair, and he has like these Roman guards around him, and then there's all the angry Jews they throw Jesus up here in front of him, and this trial happens. And so let's go through verse by verse and take a look at the specifics. So verse 1, very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and the teachers of the law and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. So the reason that they're bringing Jesus to Pilate was because the Romans had taken away the Jewish authority to be able to enact corporal punishment. So if the Jews would have just killed Jesus themselves, they would have been against the law for murder. So they would have been in trouble. So that's why they had to bring Jesus to Pilate for this to happen. Also, I believe that they wanted Jesus to die, but they didn't want it fully on their shoulders. I think legally they had to bring him to Pilate, and I also think if Pilate was the one who did it, they could be like, Rome did it, not us. You know what I mean? I think that's partially what they were trying to do. But specifically, Rome had taken away their ability to enact corporal punishment. Verse 2 through 5. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. So what was Jesus being accused of? It doesn't necessarily spell it out in this account, but if you look through the other three accounts, it does spell out what they were accusing Jesus of. One thing they were accusing Jesus of was that he was trying to get his leaders to not pay taxes, which, first of all, is just not true. If you read the accounts, he actually taught his people to pay taxes. He said, give to Caesar what is Caesar, and give to God what is God's. So first of all, it's just not a true accusation. The second accusation they brought against Jesus was treason. So they said, this guy Jesus, he's claiming to be king. And again, that one's more true in a way. Jesus did claim to be king. But what's not true is that he never was claiming to be a political king. He was never claiming to be a geographical king that would threaten Caesar. What he was claiming was that he had a spiritual kingdom of which he was the king. The kingdom of heaven. That's what he was talking about. So he never was like, I'm going to upthrow the politicians. That was not Jesus' thing. So again, the second claim is a little bit more true, but not entirely true. And then the third accusation that they brought before Pilate was terrorism, that Jesus was causing riots. And now that's also not true. Jesus was not causing riots. He was actually more of a peaceful guy. And so they're throwing these false accusations, but they're giving these accusations because they should be red flags in Pilate's mind that he would want to get rid of Jesus. They're trying to convince Pilate with everything they can to get Jesus to be put to death. However, if you look, Jesus made no reply. He didn't even defend himself. Can you imagine that you are on trial to be put to death and you're just like, you're not even going to make a reply? That seems crazy to me. Why would Jesus not be making a reply? And I think that there's several reasons. One, he knew what his mission was. He knew that his mission was to go to the cross for the forgiveness of sins. So he knew that. So trying to defend himself, why? There would be no point. He knew what he had to come for. Second, he was self-assured, unlike a true criminal. A true criminal would be like, oh, but I did blah, 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 I didn't do that, da-da-da, like a true criminal would do. They try to make excuses. Jesus was like, nope, I'm not going to make excuses. I'm not going to explain it away. But I think the biggest reason why Jesus made no reply was to fulfill prophecy. He was fulfilling a prophecy from Isaiah, which is in the Old Testament or in the Jewish scriptures. This was written quite a long time before Jesus walked this earth in a human body. Check this out, Isaiah 53 verse 7. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, And as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. What is this prophecy talking about? So again, this was way before Jesus walked the planet in a human body. And this was Jewish prophecy for the coming chosen one, the coming Messiah or Christ. And why is the sheep talk happening? So they would use a sheep they would call it like a sacrificial lamb. So for the forgiveness of sins, they would sacrifice a lamb, and then they would eat the lamb at Passover. And I know that sounds crazy. Here in America in 2025, if you found someone sacrificing a lamb, you would probably be freaked out. I know that I would. I'd be like, what is happening? What is going on? And if 2,000 years from now, if somebody talks about what we're doing in 2025, it'll also sound crazy. So that doesn't mean that the Bible is insane just because it was in a different time period. But it was important because it was said that life is in the blood. And so when the humans rebelled and sinned against God, the giver of life, the giver of good things, when you go against the opposite of the giver of life, what do you get? Death. That only makes sense. And so what they would do is they would sacrifice the lamb, and the bloodshed was the representation of death that was representative for the forgiveness of sins. The lamb was being punished in the place of the humans. And that was the importance of it. And so they would do this, and they would also eat the lamb. They wouldn't just kill it and then just be like, all right, we're done with that. They would also eat the lamb for Passover. And so by Jesus not saying anything, he was saying something huge. By not saying anything, he was saying that he was the fulfillment of this prophecy, which is an insanely huge claim. He was claiming to be the sacrificial lamb himself by not replying to Pilate. He was claiming to be the fulfillment of this prophecy of the chosen one of God that would not open his mouth but become the sacrifice, the bloodshed for our sins. And now we move on. Let me get back to Mark here. Okay. So, now in verse 6 through 8, that's what we got. Sweet. Now it was custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. So Barabbas was one of the people that actually did. He was one of the people that were like, I'm going to overthrow Rome. So he was one of the people that was doing the thing that Jesus was accused of, even though Jesus didn't do it. That's what Barabbas was. And so he committed murder, and so he was up for the death penalty as well. And now, at Restored Church, we don't always get into the nitty-gritty of like exactly what the words mean all the time, because a lot of times pastors try to do it just to sound smart, but it doesn't actually mean anything. It's not that important. But with Barabbas, it is very important. It is very important to know what Barabbas means, because it's key to this whole narrative. So, Barabbas, if you break it down, the etymology of the word, bar, from what it starts of, is the son of. And so take my family, for example. So my grandpa was Henry, my dad, Steve, and me, Simon. So you could say Simon, bar, Steve, Steve, bar, Henry. It would be like a genealogy, meaning Simon, the son of Steve, Steve, the son of Henry. It's really important that bar, the son of. And then Abba, not actually the Swedish pop band that sings Dancing Queen. It actually means father. Abba, father. So when you take Barabbas's name, Barabbas, the son of the father, that's what it means. Do you know anyone else who is known as the son of the Father or the Son of God? We'll come back to that. So, that's what Barabbas means. And now in verse 8, it talks about the crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. I know I already mentioned this. It is important to know that this crowd was a very similar crowd to the people who were just really excited about Jesus. The people on Palm Sunday that they were like, let's go. A ton of the same people. The people who were Jesus followers at the time when he's coming in on Palm Sunday, they either still believed and they were hiding, or they had turned against him. And so this crowd was a very similar crowd to the ones that were excited. We keep going on in verse 9. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up to the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with you called king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. You can see Pilate knew it was out of envy that Jesus was brought to him. He could tell it was a setup, and he didn't want responsibility for it either. Remember how the Jews earlier were like, they don't really want the responsibility on themselves. They're giving it to Pilate. And Pilate is now bouncing it back to them. He's like, well, then I guess what do you want me to do? So neither one of them want to take credit for the murder of Jesus. And also at this point in the story, the final verdict on Jesus has not happened yet. So imagine if we didn't read the whole thing. Imagine this was your first time hearing it, and you're up at this point in the story, and you're like, what's going to happen? What decision are they going to make? And then in verse 13, it shows us the decision that the crowd makes. "Crucify him," they shouted. Pilate says, "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." They want Jesus dead. But it's significant that it was crucifixion, that it wasn't another way of death. Because they could have killed him plenty of ways. They could have thrown him off a cliff. They could have, say, stoned him or whatever it was. Or hang him. Or they could have murdered him. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of how to murder people in the first century. But they chose crucifixion specifically because of what it represented. From a Roman perspective, a crucifixion was someone who would have been a slave or a rebel, not a king. Somebody who's crucified is not a king. That's not how they would honor a king. So it was significant that they chose crucifixion. Secondly, from a Jewish perspective, it actually meant cursed by God, which would be the exact opposite of God's chosen one. Jesus claiming to be God's chosen one, the Christ, the Messiah. It would have meant the exact opposite. Check out this verse from Deuteronomy. So this would have been in the Jewish law. It says this: anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. So they think if they can get him crucified, and it's nobody's fault. The Jewish people are like, oh, Pilate did it. Pilate is like, oh, the Jewish people want to do it, and he's crucified. That means he's not a king. He's not God's chosen one. He's cursed by God. He's a nobody, and it's nobody's fault. That's really what they're trying to get at here. And then in verse 15, the sentence is finally brought. Mark 15:15. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Pilate did this to satisfy the crowd. He chose to go with Barabbas, the fake son of the Father, instead of the true Son of God. This is important because the Jews and Pilate chose the cheap alternative instead of the real deal. Much like when me and Joseph went and bought that crappy grapple, we went with the cheap alternative instead of the real deal. And how did it work out for us? It was bad. And the Jews and the Romans were doing the exact same thing. They're taking the cheap alternative Son of the Father instead of the true one and only Son of God. And I know when we look at this from our perspective, we might say we wouldn't choose Barabbas over Jesus. Like if we were Pilate or we were the Jews, obviously we'd make the right decision, right? We'd choose to release Jesus. We don't want to kill Jesus, right? Like we'd all say that. But if you think about it on a deeper level, we choose cheap alternatives over Jesus all the time. All the time in our life we do this. We choose the cheap alternative over the Jesus way of doing things with our family, with our money, with our work, with our friendships, sex, marriage, whatever it is. We choose cheap alternatives over the Jesus way constantly. Take marriage, for example. The Jesus way of doing marriage is to both submit to one another as in reverence for Christ. To always put the other one above ourselves, right? That would be the Jesus way of doing it. But what do we actually do? we choose ourselves over our spouse constantly. We choose selfishness. We choose, what do I want? We choose, how do I want in my marriage to spend this money or whatever, instead of the Jesus way of submitting to your spouse. You take money, for example. The Jesus way of handling money is to be generous, to give it to others, to give it to the church, to be wise with it, to not overspend, to plan with it. But what do we do in our lives? We choose the cheap alternative all the time. We hoard it for ourselves, or we make no plan and spend it willy-nilly, and then we're stressed out about it all the time. We choose the non-Jesus way constantly. We choose the alternative. Think about it with work. The Jesus way of going to work would be going to work hard, to honor God, to show our coworkers the love of Jesus, to show the people that we interact with the love of Jesus. But how do we treat work sometimes? Maybe we just treat it to climb a ladder, to get more promotion, just to get people that we're in charge of. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe we just go to work just to slack off and just get a paycheck. Either way is not the Jesus way of doing it. And I'm not saying this like, you guys all stink. You don't do the Jesus way, I do. No, I'm the exact same as you guys. We all choose the cheap alternative over Jesus in our lives constantly. And even when we do these things wisely, say we do handle our family wisely, say we do handle our work wisely, our money wisely, we still idolize it and worship it over Jesus. Even if we handle our money how he says, we can still worship our money. We can still worship our work. We can still worship our family instead of him. And every time when we do this, even if for a little bit it seems like it's going well, it will always turn into turmoil every single time. Whenever we choose our own way instead of the Jesus way of doing things, it's guaranteed to turn to turmoil, just like that grapple bucket was guaranteed to wear out and become a problem for me. But this isn't new. This goes all the way back to the beginning of time, to the beginning of humanity. When God created humans, he created it with everything they need. They had a perfect life, a perfect situation, perfect relationship with him and each other. He said, look at all these trees. You can eat from any of these trees that you want except for the one. And what did they do? They chose the cheap alternative tree instead of what God had for them. And what did this do? This brought the sin. This brought the death that we had already talked about. Us choosing the cheap alternative creates brokenness and brings death and suffering into this world. However, God knew in his foresight that Pilate and the Jews would choose to have Jesus crucified. He knew in his foresight that we would be choosing other things over him constantly. When Jesus went to the cross, and remember how we talked about how this means that he had God's curse on him? And in a way, he did. He had God's curse for us on him. This is back to that Isaiah prophecy. So right before it talks about the sheep not talking, this is what it says. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. What the Jews thought they were doing to squish Jesus out by putting God's curse on him, they were actually putting God's curse on him for all who would ever believe for the rest of time. They were putting God's curse that I deserved on Jesus by hanging him on the cross, which offers forgiveness. When we place our faith in Jesus, God's curse transfers from us onto us, transfers to Jesus. And so, what do we do with this? What is the application for this? First of all, choose the Jesus way of life instead of the cheap alternative. Maybe you are not yet a Jesus believer and a Jesus follower. Maybe for you, maybe you have to think about, is the Jesus way of doing life, is it actually better? Would that actually benefit my life? If maybe that's where you're at, think about doing that. If you are a Jesus believer and Jesus follower, then start doing it. You know what I mean? And it's not like we're not like an actions-based religion or an actions-based church where it's like, you got to do X, Y, Z to be acceptable around here. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you have placed your faith in Jesus and your sins are forgiven, Start living like it. Start living the Jesus way of life in every area of your life. And if you're unsure of what the Jesus way of living in any certain circumstance looks like, that can be confusing. I can see how a pastor is saying, the Jesus way of life, and you're like, well, what is that? Check out the New Testament. It actually spells it out fairly clearly for you, how to interact with your family and your work and your neighbors, with your kids, everything. Check it out in the New Testament. And check out and come to Restore Church, because we talk about it all the time. So choose the Jesus way of life instead of the cheap alternative. And lastly, trust in Jesus to forgive you even when you don't choose him. I know that this is not an action. You can't physically do it, but you can trust in Jesus to forgive you even when you constantly choose the cheap alternative. He is there for you. He loves you. He cares for you. He went to the cross so that you could be forgiven even when you don't choose him. I'm going to pray for us, and then we are going to do communion. Father, thank you for sending Jesus to the cross for my sin, for my rebellion against you, so that I could be forgiven. I thank you that you saw what was happening. You knew the right time period. You knew all the pieces would come together for the forgiveness of sins for me and for the world. I pray for anyone here who has not yet placed their faith in you, that they will do that, that you'll draw them to yourself, that you'll use Restore Church to be light and love in these people's lives. I pray for anyone not at Restore Church, that you use us to show love and care for all the people we interact with. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.